Back with another reading, pages 10 through 20 uh, of 1984, George Orwell's book from 1948, written in 1948. Um, I like doing these readings at night so you can kind of get the thoughts there at night. But last time we talked about how Winston really was trying to get some time to himself because everything is monitored in his world in 1984. Um, and when I thought about the first 10 pages with Big Brother watching you, uh, it's a world where we could be in that kind of a situation if we're not careful and understanding our freedoms and liberties. So, getting back to the book, I don't want to waste any more time, and then I'll kind of chime in when there might be some things that could be difficult um, for people to understand. So, I'll go and start from yesterday. Yesterday, the ending part was April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be around that date, since he was fairly sure that his age around was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary for the future, for the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment around the doubtful date on the page and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken had come home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of the nature impossible. Either the future world would resemble the past, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it. His predicament would be meaningless. For some time he gazed stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was he had originally intended to say. For weeks past he had been making ready for this moment. It had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was to transfer to the paper the interminable restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally, for years. At this moment, however, even if the monologue had dried up, moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably, he dare not scratch it, because if he did so, it would become inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of the skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music and the slight booziness caused by the gin. Suddenly he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding his first capital letters, finally even its full stops. April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks, all war films. One very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience much amused by the shots of huge fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights. Then he was full of holes, and the sea round his turned pink and sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in water. Audience shouting with laughter when he sank. Then you saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman, might have been Julia, sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he was trying to burrow right into the woman, putting her arms around him and comforting, although she was blue with fright herself, all the time covering up as much as possible as if she thought her arms could keep the bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb in among them. Terrific flash, and the boat went all to Matchwood. Then there was awful shot of child's arm going up, 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 right into the air of a helicopter with a camera in the nose. Must have followed it up, and there was a lot of applause from the party seats. But a woman down in the pro part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting they didn't order of showed it in front of kids. They didn't ain't right, not in front of kids. It ain't until the police turned her out. I don't suppose anything to happen to her. Nobody cares what the pros say. Typical pro reaction. They never. Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what he had made him pour out this stream of rubbish, which is what it sounds like. But the curious thing that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. It was now he realized, because of this other incident, and suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It had happened the morning of the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100, and in the records department where Winston worked, they were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in center of the hall opposite the big telescreen in preparation of the 2 minutes hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people whom he knew by sight had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked at fiction department, presumably since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner. She had some mechanical job of one of the novel writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27, with thick hair, freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet slash emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League was wound several times round the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths, and community hikes, and general clean-mindedness which she managed to carry with her. He disliked nearly all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies and noser-outs of unorthodoxy. But this girl gave him an impression of being more dangerous than most. Once they passed into the corridor, she gave him a quick a sidelong glance, which seemed to pierce right into him for a moment, had filled him with terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That, it was true, was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness, which had fear mixed up in, as well as hostility, whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a man of the inner party and the holder of some posts so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of his nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people around the chairs as they saw the black overalls of the inner party member approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with a thick neck and a coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of the formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. He had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming, in some indefinable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture which anyone had still thought in such terms might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, and not solely because he was intrigued, but by the contrast of O'Brien's urbane manner and his prize fighter's physique. Much more it was because of his secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in the face suggested it irresistibly. And again, perhaps it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had appearance of being that you could appearance of a person being that you could talk if somehow you would cheat the telescreen and get him alone. Winston had never made the smallest effort to verify his guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch, saw that it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay at the records department until the 2 minutes hate was over. He took a chair in the same row as Winston, a couple places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who worked into the next cubicle to Winston was between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. In the next moment, a hideous grinding speech as some monstrous machine running without oil burst the telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one teeth's edge and bristled the hair at the back of one neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed on the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was renegade and backslider who once long ago, how long ago nobody quite remembered, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level Big Brother himself, then had engaged in counter-revolutionary activities, had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The programs of the 2 minutes of hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was a primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations sprang directly out of his teaching. Somewhere or other, he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies. Perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of the foreign paymasters. Perhaps even, so it occasionally rumored, in some hiding place in Oceania itself. Winston's diagram was constructed. He could never see the face of Goldstein without painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and small goatee beard. A clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable. And with a kind of senile silliness in a long thin nose near the end of the pair of spectacles was perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice, too, had a sheep-like quality. Goldstein was delivered his usual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party, an attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it, and yet plausibly even enough to fill one with an alarm feeling that other people, less level-headed than oneself, might be taken in by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed, all this in rapid polysyllabic speech, which was a sort of parody that had of the habitual style of the orators of the party, and even contained newspeak words, more newspeak words, indeed, than any other party would normally use in real life. And all the while, lest one should be in any doubt to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered, behind the head on the telescreen, there marched the endless columns of the Eurasian army, row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces who swarmed up to the surface of the screen and vanished, to be replaced by exactly similar. The dull rhythmic tramp of the soldiers' boots formed the background to Goldstein's bleating voice. Before the hate had proceeded, for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied sheep-like face on the screen and a terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it were too much to be borne. Besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred more constant than Eurasia or East Asia, since when Oceanic was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. But the strange But that was a strange, although Goldstein was hated and despised by everyone, although every day and 1,000 times a day on platforms, on the telescreen, in newspapers and books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to the general gaze for the pitiful rubbish they were. In spite of all this, his influence never seemed to grow less. Always were the fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies and saboteurs acting under his directions were not unmasked by the thought police. He was a commander of the vast, shadowy army and underground network of conspirators dedicated to overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. There were also whispered stories of the terrible book, a compendium of all the heresies of which Goldstein was the author and which circulated clandestinely here and there. It was a book about title. People referred to it, if at all, simply as the book. But one knew of such things only through vague rumors. Neither the Brotherhood nor the book was the subject of any ordinary member party would mention if there was a way of avoiding it. In its second moment, the hate rose to frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places and shouting at the tops of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening, bleating voice that came from the screen. The little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like that of a landing fish. Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight, as though he were standing up to the assault of a wave. The dark-haired girl behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine, swine, swine!" And suddenly she picked up the heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid movement, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of the chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes of hate was not that one was obliged to act apart, but on the contrary, that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one even against one's will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was abstract. It was an abstract, undirected emotion which could be switched from one object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. Thus, at one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein at all, but on the contrary, against Big Brother, the party, and the thought police. And at such moments, his heart went out to the lonely, derided heretic on the screen, sole guardian of truth and sanity in the world of lies. And yet the very next instant he was one with the people about him, and all that was said was Goldstein seemed to him to be true. At those moments his secret loathing of Big Brother changed into adoration, and Big Brother seemed to tower up an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia, and Goldstein, in spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter capable of the mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. It was even possible at moments to switch one's hatred his way, or that by voluntary act, suddenly by the sort of voluntary effort which wrenches one's head away from the pillow in nightmare. Winston succeeded in transferring his hate from the face of the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death and with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to the stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat at the moment of climax. Better than that, moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, because he wanted to go to bed with her and he would never do so, because round her sweet supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only an odorous scarlet sash, aggressive symbol of chastity. The hate rose to climax. The voice of Goldstein had become an actual sheep's bleat, and for an instant the face changed into that of a sheep. Then the sheep face melted into the figure of a Eurasian soldier who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, with submachine gun roaring, and seemed to spring on the surface so that some of the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seats. But at the same moment, drawing a deep sigh of relief from everybody, The hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother. Black-haired, mustachioed, I don't know why I was screwed that up, mustachioed, full of power and mysterious calm, so vast that it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few words of encouragement, the sort of words that are uttered in the din of battle, not distinguishedly individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. Then the face of Big Brother faded away again, and instead the three slogans of the party stood out in bold capitals. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. But the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen, as though the impact that it had made on everybody's eyeball was too vivid to wear off immediately. The little sandy-haired woman had flung herself forward over the back of the chair with a tremendous murmur that sounded like "My Saviour." She extended her arms backwards towards the screen. Then she buried her face in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the entire group of people broke into deep, slow, rhythmic chant of "Big Brother, Big Brother, Big Brother," over and over again, very slowly, a long pause between the B and the second, and a heavy murmurous sound, somehow curiously savage in the background, of which one seemed to hear stamp of naked feet and throbbing of tom-toms. For perhaps as much as 30 seconds they kept it up. It was to refrain from the party had heard in moments of overwhelming confusion. Partly it was sort of a hymn to wisdom of the majesty of Big Brother, but still more it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. Winston's entrails seemed to grow cold in the 2 minutes of hate. He could not help sharing in the general delirium, but this subhuman chanting of Big Brother, always filled him with horror. Of course, he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise. To dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do what everybody else was doing was an instinctive reaction. That's important right there. Very important. An instinctive reaction. Don't just follow the herd. But there was a space of a couple of seconds during which the expression of eyes might conceivably have betrayed him. It was exactly at this moment that the significant thing happened, if indeed it happened. Kind of leave it there because there are some big parts of this, but the whole point of this is that he's getting caught up in the frenzy and doesn't understand, or trying to understand, why he is caught up in the frenzy of cheering on Big Brother, which is taking away his freedoms by keeping him captive by war, by keeping him captive of their own ideologies, and not adoring them the freedoms that they have, and getting the sheep rounded up. Till next time, a reading of George Orwell's. This is Dave Schuman signing off.